What's up, guys? So today we're going to take a look into the overview of anatomy and physiology. So in this particular video, we're going to break it down into two parts. The first part here today, we're going to look at the definition of anatomy, physiology. We're going to look at some of the directional terms, root words, suffixes, things of those natures, as well as the individual composition of cells as they build up into higher complex levels of organization. So with that said, let's go ahead and look at the first thing we're going to talk about, and that's the definition of anatomy. So what exactly is anatomy defined as? Well, anatomy is the study of the structures of the human body and their positional relationship to one another. So if we break that down, it's the study of the structures. So yes, we have heart, we have lungs, we have all of these organs and muscles and bones and everything else in the body. Those are the structures. Now, we're looking at these structures and their positional relationship to one another. So it's not just easy to say, like, well, this object is here. Usually we say something is in a position in relation to another structure. For instance, and we'll use certain directional terms like superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, and lateral and all that. We'll look at the definitions of those words later on. So for instance, I would say that my heart is more medial than my lungs. My lungs are both here on the sides or lateral, and my heart is in the center. Or I could say that my breastbone, my sternum here, is more anterior or in front of my heart, which is posterior. So with anatomy looking at the structures and where they are, physiology is the study of those structures and how they work in systems, in bodily systems, how they work together, how they work independently. So with physiology, we have good understandings of how everything works in the human body, though it's always not complete. But when we think we have the idea of optimum function in mind and the function deviates from what we perceive to be normal function, that is what we call pathology. Pathology is the study of disease and dysfunction of the physiological systems of the human body. So if my heart is supposed to pump blood at this rate and it's not, and it's, let's say or my blood pressure is supposed to be one thing, 120 over 80, but it's excessively high, then I might have a pathology or a condition that gives me high blood pressure, such as hypertension. So the next thing we're going to look at is a big reoccurring theme all throughout anatomy and physiology, medicine in general. It all revolves around this golden word called homeostasis. So as we break down root words and suffixes, we'll see homeo means the same. Stasis is the condition of. So homeostasis roughly is to maintain a condition, maintain our body. By definition, homeostasis is the body's capacity to maintain relative consistency in its internal environment within very narrow ranges of change. In the easiest simplification of homeostasis is balance. So balance to the body, bringing in balance. Now, balance doesn't mean you're perfectly straight center. Balance could be I'm balancing on one leg with my hands flailed to the side, or I'm on a handstand or a headstand or whatever, as long as I'm balanced and still well functioned. So that's the same thing happening in your internal environment. Your bodily systems, your physiological systems are all working together to maintain the organism that is you. And so when this balance is off and we can no longer keep the scales afloat and level, then unfortunately, that is when we usually perish. So homeostasis is a very important concept to understand, and of all of the physiological systems in the body, there are two systems chiefly responsible for maintaining homeostasis. Now keep in mind that every system is absolutely necessary for us to stay alive. Like we need muscles, we need a skeletal structure, we need to digest food. But the two main systems that essentially regulate and coordinate all of these other systems and bodily functions are, one, the nervous system, and two, the endocrine system, or our glandular system or hormonal system. So together we call these systems the neuroendocrine system. So they work together to maintain function and equilibrium all throughout our body. Now, when it comes to these words that we're throwing out, so we've seen a couple already, we have a language, our anatomy is derived, and physiology is derived from the language of Greek and Latin. Now, when it comes to these Greek and Latin words, they're structured very similar to the words we use in English, because our English, as well as Spanish and other similar languages, are derived from Latin. So in these words, we typically have a root word, which is obviously the bulk, the meat of the dish, right? The root word is usually the subject. Then we could have a prefix, which is a part of the word that comes before the root word. And then we could have a suffix, which is a part of a word that comes afterwards. So the prefixes and suffixes will change the component of the root word. And in some cases, we can actually take prefixes and suffixes and place them together to create words themselves. So we're not going to get into every single root word and suffix and prefix and all that, but we'll look at a couple important ones. And then as we go through, we'll find words and I'll break down what those parts of those words mean. So some of the common root words and suffixes we'll see are first starting with a or an. So a and an are typically root words that'll come before the word. So a or an typically means lacking or without. So lacking or without. The next word we're looking at is bi and di together. Bi and di mean two or two separate. So like dissection, you're cutting something into two parts, or say bi, like biceps, the biceps brachii, meaning it has two parts of this muscle, two heads of this muscle, which brings us into cephal. The word cephal is derived from head, is the word meaning head. So biceps, that using the prefixes and suffixes and root words here, we can see what biceps means just by these words. Bi meaning two, seps is derived from cephal, which means head. So the biceps is two heads. Two-headed muscle. Biceps brachii, brachii referring to the region of the arm. This is the two-headed muscle that is on your arm. So the next root words and prefixes we're going to look at are add and ab. So you can think add like addition, ab like subtract. So addition is bringing into or adding onto, while ab is taking away from or separating. So for instance, in the movements of the body, we have abduction, which is taking our arm away from our body, and adduction, bringing it closer. Then we could have words such as hypo and hyper. Hypo means under. So hypotension means lower blood pressure, or hypoactive means you're not very active. While on the flip side, hyper, which is very easy to understand, we use that pretty commonly in today's, hyper means excessive, like hyperactive, you're excessive, you're out there, you're going wild and crazy. Or hypertension, referring to blood pressure. Another word that we look at is contra. Contra means against. So contra, like a contraindication. So if something's indicated, that means we're going to do that. While a contraindication would mean that's something against of something we would do. So a contraindication is usually something we avoid, right? So contraindications in relation to massage therapy, where we'd avoid areas of the body or avoid doing massage at all. Or you could say something like contralateral, which means contra is on the opposite side. Contralateral meaning the opposite side. So my left arm is contralateral of my right arm. It's on the complete opposite side of my body. Other words would be like inter and intra. Inter is a pretty oftenly seen word in our anatomy and the study of structures in relation to massage therapy. Inter means in between. So inter, like you interject, you jump in between something. And intra, which means within. So inter and intra are slightly different. So don't try to confuse them. Inter would mean in between. Intra means within. So for instance, if I had, say, two cells, right? Two individual cells, if there was fluid in between them, that's interstitial fluid. That's fluid that's in between these cells. If I had intracellular fluid, that means this is fluid inside those cells. So intra means within, inter means in between. They're very different concepts, so hopefully that doesn't confuse you. So some other words that we're going to look at today that's going to help us understand today's lecture as well as some future ones down the road is the either prefix or suffix cyto or cyte. Cyto is the prefix while cyte is the suffix. Both of these meaning cell. So say cytoplasm, which we'll look at in a second, means cell plasma. Or if we say had a type of cell, so such as a bone cell, bone meaning os, we have an osteocyte. So both cyto and cyte mean cell. It's just whichever end of the word it's placed at is going to kind of give you a better understanding of what type of meaning it has for the cell. And then the last one we're going to look at, which we'll see, is just I feel is a little important to remember because in relation to massage therapy, we want to understand pain. And a word that means pain is algia, not algae, which is a growth of, plant matter. We're looking at algia, A-L-G-I-A, algia, which means pain. So such as fibromyalgia. Fibro means fibrous, myo meaning muscle, algia meaning pain. So this is pain in muscles and fibers of the body. So with all of that background information of anatomy and physiology, let's go ahead and start breaking down the body from its basic root substances. Now, we structure the body in a particular way. We call this the levels of organization. So the levels of organization start from very small matter and build its way up. Now, for massage therapists, we're only going to look at a certain section and above for this level of organization. But the level of organization would start at subatomic particles, into atomic particles, into molecular structures, into protein filaments, and then we would get into the cellular level. So the protein filament level and below, we're not going to look at. We're not microbiologists in any sense of the means, so we don't look at those. We don't need to know the cellular and microbiology function. Well, we'll look at cellular, but the microbiology function of protein filaments and this, that, and the other, it's kind of beyond our need to know information. So massage therapists pertain themselves with the cellular level and above. So all of those little previously mentioned components come together and form a cell. So a cell is the smallest structural and functional unit that exists as a self-sustaining entity. The smallest structural and functional unit that exists as a self-sustaining entity. So basically that means this cell is an individual person. Say for instance, if your body were a nation, right, or even a planet, right, it's a whole planet, you would have these different cells in your body. So I have cells from, if my body was Earth, I would have cells from America. I would have cells from South America. I would have cells from all of Europe and Africa and Asia and all the major continents where people exist. We'll say those are different groups of cells, right? Different cells with their own different environments and components and characteristics, right? So when all of these cells come together, when groups of like cells come together, they form tissues. So tissues would be the countries in which these cells are made of. In this example that I am a planet organism and the humans inhabiting this planet are my cells. So the American cells come together to make America. South American cells come together to make South America, and so on and so forth, right? So then these tissues come together and form organs. Right? So all of these organs. So for instance, we could say if you broke down America, so America would be made of all of these different cells which made up different states, and we could say those are types of tissues. And then all those different tissues, say, Alabama, Arkansas, North America, North Dakota, South Dakota, all of these different states coming together, then acting as one whole, an organ or country, such as, say, in South America, we have all these other countries working together to become, that is, South America. I hope this example isn't confusing you guys, but cells come together, they group with like cells to form tissues. Then we have different tissue types come together to make organs. So then these organs, independently on themselves, don't function completely. They still rely on other systems to thrive. So then these organs start working with other organs to form organ systems, right? And then these organ systems will all come together to make us the organism. So our entire body, from organism, we are a complex structure of multiple functions and systems working together at their base root of organs into the tissues that the organs are made of, down to the cellular individual person that it is. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at that smallest little unit and work our way up into the tissues and then eventually into organs. So we're looking at the cell. As we said, the cell is essentially you, right? It would be the individual person. It is the single person in your body. It is the lone little worker in your body. And then of course they come together and they all do similar jobs. So keeping in mind that the cell is just like a person, we have some things in a cell that is very similar to an actual person. So as a person, I have skin on the outside of my body. We could say that this skin is kind of like a membrane. So cells have membranes, just like we do. It is essentially the outer skin that allows material to come in or be excreted out. So we call that the cell membrane. Then we have, inside of our own bodies, we have a liquid matrix like blood, which blood is mostly made of blood cells, and plasma. So plasma is that liquid matrix inside of our body. So a cell has a liquid matrix inside of it. We call that the intracellular fluid. This is the fluid inside the cell. So the cytoplasm is cyto, there's our word, our prefix there, meaning cell, cytoplasma, or plasm, meaning the plasma inside a cell. The plasma of the cell. So this is that fluid that's inside the actual cell. Then of course, as us as humans, we have a structure, and the structure is given to us by bones. Well, bones are our skeletons. So a cell is no different in that it has structure, aka a skeleton, or what we would call a cytocell skeleton. So as us, being that we have organs and all these organs work together, well, cells can have organs. Now, I'm pretty sure you might be familiar with that picture of a cell where it has all of these little organelles in them. Now, keep in mind that that is just a good general cell that is just stuffed full of all these organelles to show you where they would be in a cell and what they would look like. Now, keep in mind that not every single cell has all of these organelles, or some cells have almost none, such as red blood cells. They're usually the worker drones and usually don't have any of these organelles outside of a few. Or some cells might be very specialized and have a lot of organelles. So some of the organelles we'll look at are first the endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum, also known as the ER, is a protein and lipid synthesizing powerhouse of the cell. So when it comes to that endoplasmic reticulum, there's two types. We could have rough or we could have smooth. So if it's smooth, it lacks the presence of what we call ribosomes. And so therefore it only synthesizes lipids, fats. Now if it has ribosomes, we consider it to be rough because ribosomes are tiny little balls, tiny little pockets of what we call RNA, ribonucleic acid, which is part of our genetic makeup. So ribosomes themselves, we say, synthesize proteins, right, and store RNA, and they are found either free-floating around the cell, around the nucleus, or attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. So that gives us two organelles, the endoplasmic reticulum and ribosomes. Of course, the endoplasmic reticulum might harbor ribosomes. Now the next organelle we're looking at is called the Golgi Body. The Golgi Body is what we call the package and delivery system. So essentially, the Golgi body will package material and store it for later use in the cell, or it'll package it up and then send it outside the cell for it to be used somewhere else. And we'll see how this process occurs. Then, of course, we have the mitochondria, which I'm sure from everyone's 8th grade biology class, you know it's the mighty mitochondria. You didn't learn how to do your taxes, but you know the mitochondria is what creates energy for the cell. So the mitochondria is what provides the energy for the cell. So some cells don't have mitochondria, such as the red blood cells, and some cells that need a lot of energy have a lot of mitochondria in them, such as the muscle cells. Now, the next thing we're looking at is the lysosomes. So I like to think Lysol. Lysosomes, Lysol. Lysol is the cleaning product. So lysosomes are the cleaning organelles. Lysosomes will engulf foreign matter, debris, or waste material, and then digest them and devour them. So lysosomes are what we call the janitors of the cell, or the Lysol of the cell. Then we might find centrioles present in cells. Centrioles help with cellular division. Now, not all cells divide, such as red blood cells once they mature and now have left and are free-floating in the body. So centrioles help with cellular division. Then the last thing we look at is the nucleus. The nucleus, as many people might be aware, is the brain of the cell. And the nucleus has two parts. It has what we call a nuclear membrane, just like the skin had its own membrane. The nuclear membrane is the protective layer that allows material in and out of the nucleus, as well as we have the central portion of the nucleus called the nucleolus, where most of the DNA and RNA is stored. So the nucleus contains our DNA, our deoxyribonucleic acid. So ribosomes, as we said, could be attached somewhere in the nucleus as well to the cell membrane, to the nucleus. And then, so in that case, the nucleus would contain both DNA and RNA. So those are the organelles of the cell. Those are the little organs of the cell. Now remember, not all of them have them, and some might have quite a few. So the next thing we're looking at is how these cells can move substances throughout the body. So we looked at that Golgi body and we said that it's the package and delivery system, right? It can store material or it can send it out. Well, there's ways in which substances move both around through the body or throughout the universe, right? So we can have two types of movement. We can have active and passive. So we could have passive transport systems or passive processes, or we could have active transport processes. So when it comes to the passive, well, it's just that. It's passive. It doesn't require energy or effort to do it. It usually does it on its own based off of, other natural factors. So the first passive process we're looking at is what we call diffusion, which many people would be aware of and familiar with diffusion if you have aromatic devices such as a literal diffuser for aromatherapy or oils, or if you just have like a can of some spray goods, some Febreze or air freshener, that can has a high concentration of smell good in it, and then when you press that button it disperses into the larger atmosphere and it diffuses or dissolves into the area. So typically passive processes come from high pressure to low pressure. Not always the case, but in this case of diffusion it does. So, or another instance would be taking a sugar cube and throwing it in a cup of coffee. That sugar cube is a high concentration of sugar, while the rest of the coffee isn't, so then it dissolves to permeate and fill the cup as equally as it can. So the next passive process we're looking at is osmosis. Now there's a few forms of osmosis, but the most simple version of osmosis is water to salt. Water to salt. Water wants to go to salt in order to balance it out. And that usually occurs through a selectively permeable membrane, which then conforms to try to equal out the balance between water to salt on both sides of the membrane. So the easiest idea to grasp on this concept is that saltwater fish and freshwater fish. If you take a saltwater fish and throw it in a freshwater pond, well, what's going to happen is that fish on its inside is very salty. So the water outside and around this fish does not have any salt. And so it wants to go into the fish to balance out the salt content between the fish's skin, or in this case the membrane. So that's going to make the fish bloat up. And then vice versa, you take that freshwater fish and throw it in a saltwater lake or the ocean. Well, the salt in the water around the fish is going to suck and pull all the water from the inside of that fish out into it in an effort to balance it. So remember, osmosis is salt to water in the easiest definition of the sense there. And then the last passive process we're looking at is filtration. So filtration, like filtering a cup of coffee, is usually using pressure, such in the case of filtering a cup of coffee, it's the barometric pressure and gravity, the pressure of gravity, pulling water through that membrane. So other forms of filtration would be, say, in your kidneys, where we have blood vessels going through very narrow tubes, which then squeeze and wring them out, or in the capillary beds, which we'll see later on, wringing out these substances, and then those substances filter through a membrane. So filtration, I'm sure we have a good idea of what that is. So let's look at the passive or active processes, or the active pumps, as we usually say. So when it comes to those active processes, one of which we move substances is through the use of pumps. So pumps obviously take energy to use. Now there's two major pumps that we see in the human body, and that is the sodium-potassium pump and the calcium pump. So the sodium-potassium pump is the responsible mechanism that facilitates nerve conduction. We exchange sodium and potassium ions back and forth that is going to change the polarity and electricity of those nerves, which allows for conduction of those nerves. The calcium pump is found in muscle cells, in the muscle fibers, which calcium is the responsible mineral for muscle contraction. So we see how that works when we get to those systems. Now, when it comes to those cells with active and passive processes, we're looking at what we call endocytosis and exocytosis. So now we're looking at endocytosis and exocytosis. So again, we're seeing some of those words we previously mentioned here. We're seeing cyte, right? Well, let's break down some of those other words. So endocytosis. So endo is a word that means within. Endo means inward or inside. So endo means inside. Then we have cyte, which means cell. So this means something in the cell. Osis is a word meaning the condition of. So this is the condition of a cell bringing something into itself. So endocytosis is what we call cell eating. So a cell will engulf something and eat it. Now, exocytosis, exo is a word meaning outer, and cyte meaning cell, and osis again meaning the condition of. So this is the condition of sending something outside of the cell. And that's what the Golgi body would do. It would send something outside of itself. So for instance, like your glandular system obviously is going to send out hormones. That's exocytosis. We're sending out substances from the cells that create the hormones and this, that, and the other. So when it comes to that endocytosis, we look at two types of endocytosis, two ways in which cells bring substances into themselves. So one is what we call phagocytosis, and then the other is what we call pinocytosis. Now, pinocytosis is more common. Phagocytosis is usually, for the relation to massage therapy, is usually the process more common with taking a cut or a scrape, because there's usually foreign debris and actual hard matter that would need to be engulfed and eaten. So phagocytosis is performed by what we call a phagocyte, or a cell that performs phagocytosis. So phagocytosis is what we call cell eating. So this means that a phagocyte will have foreign debris and come in and just engulf it into itself and then dissolve it, usually with a lysosome. And then pinocytosis, I like to think pinocytosis like Pinot Grigio, a wine, you drink wine. So pinocytosis performed by a pinocyte is what we call cell drinking. So There's two ways, like we said, in which cells bring substances in, which is phagocytosis and pinocytosis. Either we eat it or we drink it. Like we said, drinking is more common because there's more liquid substances in our body than there are hard materials. As we say, we've looked at these cells pretty well, and we were looking at the levels of organization, so that gives us these cells coming together, right? We've seen the basic makeup of the cells, we've seen some of the functions that they can serve and do. Now, when all of these cells come together and they group up with like cells, they create what we call tissues. So with that said, we're going to end it here and pick it up in the next video, starting with tissues, membranes, and the directional terms of the body. So stay tuned, take your notes, and I'll see you in the next video.